You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. I'm your host, Ray Gerard, and this is the program that asks, well, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were here and could write a letter to Americans, not the Ephesians, Colossians, the Romans, but to Americans? What would he think it would be important for us to hear? What would he want to tell us? Well, we're going to give you precisely such a letter today. And as we do that, we look at some issue in our society and our culture that is current. We look at something in the news, and today that is going to be a fellow by the name of Shaun King. If you haven't heard about him, you will. He is basically calling for all pictures, all stained glass windows, all statues, all depictions of Jesus to be removed from everywhere that they're located. And so we're going to be looking into that, asking why would he be asking for that? What's his particular complaint? Are there any people that share that same view that he does? And why would that all be? And what would St. Paul think about that? So we are going to start with a letter from St. Paul, which says simply this: "Put to death, then, the parts of you that are earthly. Now you must put them all away: anger, fury, malice, slander, and obscene language. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcision and uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all." Very simple message taken from what he wrote to the Colossians almost 2,000 years ago. And the reason why this could just as easily be a letter to the Americans if it was written today is simply because the things that Paul wrote were inspired, like all Scripture, and they contain, because they're inspired, they contain principles and ideas that are true. They express truth, the truth that comes from the source of everything. And these truths, because they come from that source, are not bound by time. They don't change from one era to the next. They don't change from place to place. They don't change from people to people. What he wrote to the Colossians, he would tell also to the Americans. And why not? Put to death, then, the parts of you that are earthly. Put them all away. Anger. As we're going to look into the events that have been unfolding recently in this country, specifically this idea that images of Jesus Christ symbolize or represent white supremacy, or they effectuate white supremacy, we're going to be looking at the anger. We're going to see if we can find any anger behind a lot of these people's feelings, and ask, if that's perhaps some explanation of what they're doing. Paul says here, there is not Greek and Jew, slave, free, etc., but Christ is all and in all. It's a very different message, isn't it, than what we're hearing today. The whole message behind the accusation of white supremacy, the call for people to be more sympathetic to the plights of people of color, to people of any kind of minority, is unquestionably a good one. You want people to sympathize with other people, have compassion for other people. That's perfectly in line with things that Paul said from start to finish. There can be nothing wrong with that. Of course there isn't. But of course, a lot of the protests that we're seeing, a lot of the unrest that we're seeing in our country today is activity that includes a lot of anger. We're seeing a lot of things lit on fire. We're seeing things demolished, things destroyed, statues toppled down. There's a lot of anger in all of that. Why is that? Well, let's start with what we said we would start with. There's a gentleman by the name of Shaun King. Has some national notoriety. Apparently was one of the leaders of a sort of Black Lives Matter movement, although apparently he has been, I guess, perhaps expelled, shunned to some degree, as I hear. But in any event, he's a writer. He's a journalist, opinion piece writer and such. Anyways, I think he's got. Did I hear he's got a million, maybe not a million followers on Twitter, but he's got many followers on Twitter. At any rate, he recently put out a tweet that said, "Yes, I think the statues of the white European they claim is Jesus should also come down. They are a form of white supremacy. Always have been. In the Bible, when the family of Jesus wanted to hide and blend in, guess where they went? Egypt, not Denmark. Tear them down." And he wrote a follow-up tweet. "Yes, all murals and stained glass windows of white Jesus, all stained glass windows of white Jesus and his European mother and their white friends should also come down. They are a gross form of white supremacy, created as tools of oppression, racist propaganda. They should all come down." And then another message he wrote. "Experts have long since said this is the most likely accurate depiction of Jesus." And then he had a picture that I think he posted or linked that some apparently scientists had come up with as perhaps some type of likely depiction of Jesus, what he would have looked like. It doesn't resemble at all the image that is constructed, has been sort of reconstructed from the Shroud of Turin. But nevertheless, the man appears to be of Middle Eastern descent, skin color that is common to people of the Middle East, so darker than white and not as black as African Americans, but dark-skinned. And so he has that picture there, and he says, "White Americans who bought, sold, traded, raped, and worked Africans to death for hundreds of years in this country simply could not have this man at the center of their faith." Couldn't have a dark-skinned man at the center of their faith. Why? If your religion, he still writes, if your religion requires Jesus to be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, then your religion is not Christianity, but white supremacy. Christian whiteness, not white Christianity, has been the primary religion of this country for hundreds of years. Do we find any anger in there? He talks about that these images of a white Jesus are created as tools of oppression. And he talks about Americans who bought, sold, traded, raped, and worked Americans to death for hundreds of years in this country. He talks about the fact that if your religion requires Jesus to be blonde, blue-haired, I don't know about you, but my religion does not require Jesus to be blonde and blue-eyed and so forth. It doesn't have to be white. It really doesn't matter to me what his actual skin color was. I don't know how many Christians would say that that's true. Maybe some far extremist type people, maybe people who belong to the KKK who call themselves Christian, but then live exactly opposite to a lot of Christian beliefs and morals and principles. Maybe they might, but I don't know how many other people would. Christian whiteness, not white Christianity, has been the primary religion of this country. So what's he talking about? I mean, it seems like obviously he feels the plight of Black Americans Most of our inner cities, most of the poor parts of our inner cities are populated by Black Americans. They are certainly at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and there are lots of neighborhoods where there are no grocery stores because grocery stores won't go there. There's a host of problems that these people suffer with every day, and a lot of people look at that and say, well, other people have imposed that on them, that other people have caused this to happen to them. And, the reasons why certain people are better off and certain people are poor, you can't just say that there's only one factor. Usually there's a combination of different things. Certainly a lot of immigrant populations were very poor. They lived in ghettos and slums when they first came here. Irish Americans, Italian Americans, a lot of people now, you may compare situations and say, well, they're not comparable because obviously, none of them were subjected to slavery. But if in fact you're talking about the fact that certain people live in poor conditions today, it would be an oversimplification to say that there's just one factor, any one factor explains it. But there's resentment over it. Why should some people be better off than others? And so this resentment, produces calls for change. Something's got to change. Something's got to be done different. And in this case, Mr. King thinks part of the problem is Jesus. That as long as Jesus is white, that's a problem. And that the images that are out there now that show him as white have to be torn down. Well, how do you do that? Stained glass windows, he says, with a white Jesus, a white baby Jesus, they have to be torn down. How do you do that? A lot of things are being torn down in this country today. And how that's being done? Simple. You have mobs go and tear things down. They're tearing down statues, for example. In California, there's a statue of a saint. The saint, his last, Junipero Serra. And statues of him. He's considered the person who founded missions, Catholic missions in California in the late 18th century. Apparently he founded 9 missions, declared a saint in 2015 by Pope Francis. But a statue of his in San Francisco was torn down. Another one in Los Angeles was defaced. And in Ventura, California, and named after his mission there, I think he started a mission Buenaventura. Anyways, there was a statue there, and there was a social media campaign that was started and called for protesters to appear last Saturday at 1 o'clock to tear the statue down. Well, other people heard about this social media campaign, and they went there, mostly Catholic college students. They went there, and they surrounded the statue. They stood in front of the statue, basically putting themselves up as a human barricade. If you wanted to get to the statue, even though it was only a symbol, you'd have to go through us. And they were subjected to all kinds of insults and a lot of anger. Apparently, the protesters placed a generator, apparently it was a smoky generator, close to them, and apparently there was some fumes from that they had to suffer. But they tried to make things just uncomfortable for them, and they underwent all of that, and apparently very peacefully and praying at times, but not responding. And at one point there was a chant that was raised, something about let's get them, and there was a rush that was made on the students surrounding the statue. Now the protesters numbered apparently about 200. The people surrounding the statue I saw a picture, I don't know, maybe, 50, something of that nature, maybe less. And apparently the protesters rushed upon the defenders, and somebody, waved some type of a weapon at the defenders. Yeah, the crowd made a rush. There's a man apparently brandishing a metal stake, and he swung it threateningly. And one of the defenders grabbed hold of it. Another defender ran down the street to a parked squad car and asked the police to come closer. A few cars pulled up with lights and sirens, and apparently that was enough to cool the situation down. But it was obviously a very tense situation, and these students actually had to go there to keep people from tearing a statue down. Why would you want to tear down the statue of a saint? Why would you want to tear down the statue of a Catholic priest? It's a religious symbol. It stands for someone who believes in peace. Now, the protesters had signs calling Father Sarah, Saint Sarah, Father Genocide. And apparently the sentiment is, well, the Spanish colonizers in North America from that day and age, used the people, abused the native population, and that Father Sarah, apparently in the eyes of these protesters, was one of them. And so they call him now Father Genocide. Is there any evidence at all to suggest this man of God actually, had anything to do with the death of one person, let alone genocide against an entire population? Does it even matter? Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. If you're going to be tearing down statues of saints and tearing down statues or stained glass windows of Jesus, you're attacking symbols of peace, symbols of religion, symbols of unity, symbols of love. Maybe you don't agree with the symbol. Maybe you think, well, it's got the wrong skin color on it. But nevertheless, isn't there more to an image of Jesus than just, what his skin color is? Do we see everything now through the lens of skin color? Of course, Martin Luther King said in his dream, people wouldn't be judged by the color of their skin. And of course, if you listen to the writings of St. Paul, in the Christian community, there's not this group or that group. It's just Christ in all, is all, and in all. That's all that matters. It's just a symbol. It's just a statue. It's just a stained glass window. Why does it really matter? Why do we have to tear it down? Is there more here? What is fueling this anger? These statues and these stained glass windows have been around for hundreds of years. Why now? Well, if you think, this is, to get behind this a little bit more, Mr. King, besides just these tweets, wrote an article in the New York Daily News back December 23rd of 2015. So to help celebrate Christmas, he wrote an article called Jesus Depictions Today Further Promote a White Supremacist Agenda. He said, to be clear, Christmas in the United States, despite the name, has very little to do with Jesus Christ and everything to do with consumerism and gift-giving. That charge has been made often enough, and to a large extent it's true. But even though it does have the gift-giving, it also comes with the reminder of Jesus. The beauty of Christmas has always been that there's something deeper. There's the joy and the pleasure that comes from the giving of gifts and the receiving of gifts, but there was always something behind it, something more, something that gave it real substance. There was a reason why, I can remember a time when, you would just see people on the street, people you didn't know, and Merry Christmas, and you'd say it with a smile and with happiness. And there was more joy in the air. There wasn't joy in the air. You wouldn't say it was a complete joy, a total joy. And certainly Christmas has always been a source of depression for people. A lot of people would, look at Christmas where so many other people were so happy, and if their life wasn't going so good, they could get easily depressed. So everything's always a mixed bag. Nothing is ever amenable to simply one explanation. But more joy. There was more joy with Christmas than at other times of the year. And there was a reason why. And it wasn't because, on December 12th, you didn't go around, listening to the music on the street or what have you, and smiling at people and wishing people Merry Christmas. You didn't do that because, hey, in 13 more days, I'm going to get presents. No. I mean, and buying presents, shopping for other people, giving to other people, giving them joy. That was the Christmas spirit. And that's imitating Christ, loving other people, trying to make them happy. There was something more to it. It wasn't just, a holiday about gift giving and consumerism. That was what made it different. But Mr. King thought that it was mostly, in his view, it's mostly about consumerism. He said, and he also lumped Easter in with it. He said, however, side by side with Easter, it's also the time when we are most likely to see depictions of Jesus used as tools of white supremacy. In Atlanta, I see them everywhere I go. Jesus is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby, and his blue-eyed supermodel mother are ubiquitous and done without even a slight hint of humor. It's preposterous, he says. So he can't get into the spirit of it. And it seems, at least in part, if not, in major part, because the Jesus that he sees everywhere is the wrong skin color. We're seeing everything through a lens of skin color. He says, when we lived in California, I cringed when my children saw stringy blonde-haired surfers with beards, and they would blurt out to us, hey, looks like Jesus. I would have to stop and correct them and say, no, he looks how white people want Jesus to look. But Jesus did not look like a California surfer dude. He says, it's not simply an honest mistake, though. When the man who is deemed the central figure of a religion and indeed the savior of the entire world is consistently portrayed to look like a Scandinavian sailor when he more likely resembled a Syrian refugee, it's being done to advance an Anglo-Saxon white supremacist agenda. It's all about the agenda. The reason why he's depicted this way is because they want to dominate people, and we're going to do it with a white Jesus. Other people have often said that everybody sees Jesus the way, they want to see him. That in other parts of the world he is dark-skinned because the people in these other parts of the world are dark-skinned. If you look at, there's a famous icon of Mary where she's dark-skinned. There can be, people like to see Jesus as they see themselves. They like to identify with him. And what's wrong with that? And if you live in a country where, and this may be changing, but at least over the centuries, the majority of the population has been white, how would you expect them to depict him? Why wouldn't they want to depict him as of their, their color, so they could relate to him better? Is that not just simply an honest mistake, or is it in fact an agenda to suppress and dominate people? Is it all part of an agenda? Do people consciously or unconsciously use their religious symbols in order to justify their domination of other people? Well, for some, certainly so, perhaps so. But for most of us, all of us, there was a person who talked about the Ku Klux Klan, and apparently recently heard of a white supremacist rally planned in Knoxville, Tennessee. So this man went there. And what he found instead was that the KKK was pretty much a no-show. Other people, and maybe because of this, because other people had organized a response to the KKK gathering. And the response was called the Knoxville Kindness Rally. It was a beautiful thing to be part of, several thousand people strong. Apparently, they outnumber the KKK people by one estimate, at least 70 to 1. News headline in the paper the next day said, "Kindness takes over." So, let's talk a little bit more about the KKK folks. This person went to this rally down in Knoxville. Afterwards, I went and checked the Ku Klux Klan website. I was curious as to why they would burn crosses. And he said that the lighted cross of the night, on the website it says, the lighted cross of the Knights is no different than the average church that has a lighted cross either on top or in front of their church building. The light of the cross symbolizes the light of Christ, dispelling darkness and ignorance. It is the fire of the cross that reminds us of the cleansing fire of Christ that cleanses evil from our land. The lighted cross is a symbol of freedom, freedom from sin. Really, a lighted cross, their lighted cross. I mean, it's no different than the lighted cross on the front of a church building. So if you have a cross on the front of your church building and at night you have a spotlight shining on it, that's the same as if you take a cross in a field and burn it. You burn a symbol of Christ. Isn't it? To me, that sounds more like. To me, that's a lot more similar to tearing down images of Christ and tearing down religious symbols. You are destroying a cross. You are destroying a symbol of Christ's passion and death. You're destroying. You're causing the destruction of a symbol of what was the gateway for all of us to eternal life and union with God. But nevertheless, the KKK thinks, well, hey, this is the light of Christ that we're showing. It's not. I mean, fire is a destructive force, and they use it, but no, it's all for goodness and the destruction of evil. Well, maybe there are some people who think that way. No doubt there are. But excuse me, they're outnumbered. They're, at least in Knoxville, at that one day, they were outnumbered 70 to 1. Do we really think that this country is governed and run and administered by a whole bunch of KKK-thinking people bent on keeping black people down, and that the only reason we have stained glass windows with a baby Jesus that happens to be white is because it's all part of an agenda? The Catholic Church, for one, is the largest charitable organization in the world. And oh, by the way, it happens to help a lot of people that don't have a white skin color. Why do we have to see everything in terms of color? No doubt that for people who are a minority in this country, there can be times that are hard. There's a black Lutheran evangelical minister by the name, I can find him, Mr. Duncan, Lenny Duncan. And Mr. Lenny Duncan knows something about all of that. He formerly was incarcerated before he was ordained a minister, and he was homeless. So he knows something about poverty. He knows something about living on the streets. He knows something about the plight of poor people in this country. But now he's a minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church. He wrote, and this was a stirring passage, apparently after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. He wrote that most of the last 72 hours in my garden, he spent most of the last 72 hours in his garden planting flowers, listening to hymns, and bursting into tears. Because I'm tired of Jesus literally saying, I can't breathe on the streets of America while everyone turns their back on him. Who can listen to that man write about that? You can picture him. He spends most of the last 72 hours in his garden listening to Christian hymns, religious hymns, and crying. Because he feels in his heart the suffering of people who go unnoticed, people on whom others turn their backs. Jesus knew suffering, and people turn their backs on him. Who can't feel for this black minister? When Jesus loves, when Jesus and Mary loves, it's with a total love. It's with a love that we can't even begin to comprehend. They would certainly feel, if we suffer, if we feel pain, they certainly feel for us more than we can imagine. That's the kind of suffering, that's the kind of empathy, the kind of compassion that we get close to. We can perhaps touch a little bit. We can understand perhaps the depth of it a little bit when we're like Pastor Duncan, who is crying and weeping for these people. But Mr. Duncan has more to say than just that. He wrote a book on the demonic force of white supremacy. And recently he gave an interview where he was asked his opinion about the whole coronavirus situation and how churches are being prevented from opening while other businesses are allowed to have more patrons. And he noted that some churches are suing the government, and we can talk about a few of those cases perhaps in a minute, suing the government to try to get their churches reopened. And he doesn't quite agree with that. He says that, the victims of the coronavirus pandemic, the victims suffer more in the black community, that there are more victims in the black community than elsewhere. And so he says Christianity is willing to suffer black and brown bodies for their cause of their own personal salvation and relationship with Jesus. Because they want to open their churches. They don't care if black people die. We just need to open the churches. He says that has been part of the history of the American church experience. Of course, they are willing to sacrifice black and brown bodies to hear a full-throated hymn. He says that the healthcare system is a disaster for black communities. We've already been calling out how white evangelical Christians have not loved their neighbor. So we're back again to the empathy and the need for people to empathize with people, have compassion for people. So we're back into the Christian realm there. We're back into an area where we can certainly say, Pastor Duncan is saying, he's talking about beautiful things. But then he also says that, it's wrong to be painting blackness as always in darkness, always as evil and bad, further away from the light of God. That's the same thing we just heard a moment ago, isn't it? That there's this problem with, that blackness is seen as evil. But that's actually what it does say in the Bible, doesn't it? But it doesn't have to mean skin color. I mean, why? People talk about, evil lurking in shadow. I mean, the Bible talks about this. The Bible talks about, Jesus himself talked about, everything that comes into the light is good and fruitful, and the things that, that hide in the darkness, that is bad, generally speaking. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with having a dark skin color. Why? Where is the logic in that we have to, give up this idea between, darkness and light? Because, some people have, a light skin color and some people have a dark skin color. How are the two necessarily connected? If you look past the color of somebody's skin and look to what's in their heart. It also says in the Bible that Jesus knows what's in our hearts. If you look what's in people's hearts, it can be good or it can be bad. It can be light or it can be dark and evil. But that's what's in your heart. Where is it written that what's on the outside has to match what's on the inside? And if we're only concerned with what's on the outside, we're going to lose sight of the importance of what's on the inside. But I understand, what he's saying. He talks about the healthcare system being a disaster in the black community, that people turn their backs on the poor. Absolutely. You can't help but grieve with him, but sympathize with him, but agree with him when he talks about those things. He talks about the cunning thing about white supremacy is that not only does it always find a scapegoat, but it always finds someone who's doing worse off than you. And it creates a narrative of white American invulnerability to what's happening globally. We're always able to weather this storm because America is so exceptional, and it's the city on the hill. It's blessed and ordained by God. All of that is bull. You fill in the blank. Anger. There's anger there. Now, you may certainly say, well, a lot of that anger is perfectly justified. And, who's to say, that it isn't? But when we let that anger control what we think, are we going in the right direction? For example, why shouldn't we believe that America is a city on a hill? Why shouldn't we believe that it's blessed and ordained by God? What's wrong with that? That doesn't necessarily mean every place else is not blessed by God. Why shouldn't we have heroes? Why shouldn't we have things we look up to? Why shouldn't we have statues and stained glass windows? Why do we have to pull down, tear down, destroy everything that suggests there's hope, that there's a better tomorrow, that things are good, that people are good? If we let our anger get us to the point where we think other people have agenda, other people are oppressive, that everything is bad, that'll control us. It's like a poison. And then what will happen is we'll have more anger. And then what will happen with that anger? What will happen with that anger is exactly what's happening now. People running through the streets, burning things, looting, destroying. And destroying without rhyme or reason. Destroying businesses that belong to black people. Well, the anger can make us lose sight of the fact that we are all one. This whole idea of unity is something else that bothers people. Pastor Duncan talks about the desire for unity. He says, that's a lot of bull, and again, you fill in the blank. He said, there's a lot of bull, blank, in the name of Christian unity. Well, people will set aside the agenda of God in the name of Christian niceness. Christian niceness is a product of whiteness, and it's just as deadly as any of the other manifestations of white supremacy. So now niceness is what? Is part of the agenda. It's all part of the white supremacist cunning strategy. Now niceness is something to be despised. Niceness. We're not supposed to be nice to one another. How can you be so upset about people turning their back on other people if we're not going to be nice to one another? Does he think that niceness is all just two-faced, that it's just a facade, that we don't really mean it, it's completely insincere? That's a cynical way to look at everything. Now, no doubt, like I said before, there's reasons to be upset, reasons to be angry, but we need to control our passions with our thought. Everybody, if some people are hypocritical with their niceness, if the niceness is just a facade, it doesn't mean everybody's that way. It doesn't mean everybody's like, the people in the KKK. It doesn't mean we all want to go out and light a cross on fire in our front yard. And the people trying to tell us that everybody is like that, are preaching poison. It is disunity. It is contrary to what Christ talked about. It's contrary to what Paul talked about. The letter we just read at the beginning said, there is no this, there is no that, there is no one group or another. There's only Christ in all. He is all and he's in all, and that's it. That's it. And if you say, well, people who are not disadvantaged cannot preach unity, then you're dooming us all to preach disunity. You can lay out, some kind of criticism or ridicule of other people who you don't agree with. But what about the ideas? What about the ideas? Can someone not preach unity, because they're the wrong skin color? What about the ideas? Is unity a bad thing? Is disunity a good thing? What about the idea? Just the idea. Forget everything else. Just the idea. If the idea of unity is a good thing, if the idea of loving other people is a good thing, then why does it matter? How can it matter who says it? If it's good, if it's true, then who says it doesn't matter. Pastor Duncan talks about the fact that people turn their backs on the poor. We don't empathize enough with other people. And yet, he's preaching disunity. He's preaching the very thing he bemoans. He's preaching, that we should be separated from each other instead of drawing closer to one another. He's preaching the very thing he bemoans. And the only explanation, it seems to me, that there can be for this is because he's letting his anger sort of take control. The black situation hasn't improved year after year, decade after decade, and that'll spur a lot of cause for anger. But why not work towards solving it? Is it going to produce any progress to tear things down, to burn things? There's more to it than just this idea of the fact that black people are underprivileged and disadvantaged. There's more to it. There is an anger there. There's an anger that wants to rip the system down, rip everything down, rip society down, separate all of us from all the rest of us. It's destructive. And that's what anger does. It destroys your inner peace. And then when it destroys the peace within you, it destroys your ability to convey peace to anybody else. And then we're all at each other's throats. And how is that good for anybody? But we have to, if you want to tear things down, you can't have religion. You can't have Christ. You can't have God. You can't have a message that there's another way. If the problems that we have can be fixed by getting rid of capitalism, was capitalism the problem? If we've got to remake society, we've got to tear everything down. Is that really what's not behind this? If there's so much anger because of the way that our society has been organized, if it's all a white supremacist system, then it's all got to come down. And what is the current system? The current system is capitalism, so we got to get rid of it. So what are we going to put there instead? Well, we'll have socialism. The poor people, the people will rule. The people will decide. Well, it never works that way. You can't have, 1 million people decide what's going to happen for 1 million people. Leaders will get picked. people will make decisions for other people. And then like in Venezuela, there was a socialist professor down in Venezuela who said not too long ago, in light of all the changes they had in their country, where they got rid of the capitalistic system and now have a socialist one, but the people are poorer there now than ever before, because in her view what happened was we just exchanged one corrupt system for another, one set of corrupt leaders for another. And that's what always happens. But if there's any mistake about that, there's a person, there's people who wrote in this, there's a group called ChristianCentury.org. They are apparently a bunch of religious historians, college professors who care about the cities of God and the cities of humans. And they publish articles on this website through a partnership with the Kripke Center of Creighton University. In any event, what they write is that racism goes hand in hand with capitalism. It presumes that non-white Americans have more social mobility than the evidence suggests they actually do. Well, I don't know if it's that we assume that they have, that people assume that they have more, but that we would hope that they would have more. That, it was the American ideal for so long. It was the American dream. Anybody can be whatever they want to be if you work hard and study and so forth. Now, that's out of favor. And, to some extent, perhaps it always was a bit of a fable. But there are those who could climb up, but it gave everybody hope, and it gave everybody freedom. And if we exchange it, what are we going to exchange it for instead? Is it actually going to be better, or is it going to be more enslaving? If you, for example, all socialism, according to Marx, leads to communism. And socialism starts with forced labor. Oh, great. Sounds like slavery. Nevertheless. They talk about the fact that there's a theological association of darkness with evil, the same thing Mr. Duncan talked about. Americans continue to envision dark people, places, and things as evil. Again, does the logic follow? If you envision or regard dark places, dark ideas, dark passions as evil, do you necessarily think dark people are evil? The logic does not follow, unless you make your decisions based on what you see, unless you are very shallow in your decisions, unless you make judgments based on the color that you see on the surface of whatever it is you're looking at, and you don't look any farther past that. If you don't use reason, the people in this movement want people to be angry. Saul Alinsky preached this 50 years ago. You have to get people to be angry in order to make change. If people are not angry, people are happy, they're not going to want change. And so you got to get them angry. And so you work on their passions, you work on their emotions, and you don't work, and you don't appeal to reason. You don't give them cogent arguments, well thought out arguments. You just stoke fires. And the people that are decrying the system that we have now do precisely that. They work on people's passions. They do see things superficially. But that's, and so they think everybody else does. Because they think, they don't look past the surface of something. They think everybody else does. And they think that means that everybody who's not like them looks at them and sees the fact that that people are not like other people, and that you hate the people that are not like you. It's a superficial assessment. And this is a cyclical thing. It's a bit of a vortex. Is that we're going to be spinning faster and faster into this realm where we are not thinking about things, and we're only looking at the color of people's skin. We're looking at the color of people's skin more so now than we have in the past. in any event. So there is a definite connection in the minds of many. That capitalism is equal to racism. We have to get rid of racism, therefore we have to get rid of capitalism. The only way to do that, we're going to tear everything down, destroy everything. So part of that, of course, is fighting religion, especially if religion, as it's practiced, is white supremacist. There's a court in New York. Some churches in New York challenged executive order by Governor Pritzker. Governor Pritzker had said that religious services would be limited to 50 people until the release of a vaccine for the coronavirus. Until an actual effective vaccine was produced. And I've heard that there's never been, a successful vaccine for a virus. How long are we going to have to wait? A year, 2 years, 10 years? Until there's a vaccine, church services will be limited to 50 people. They don't impose that. He doesn't impose that same restrictions on other types of businesses. He had limited it to a cap of 10 people, but there was such an outcry that he changed that so that the 10 people limit was merely a suggestion. Well, while churches were still limited in this way, and a lot of other businesses were beginning to reopen and allowed to have greater numbers, some people sued because they said this is unfair treatment. It went to a district court, and then it went on appeal to Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. 3-judge panel looked at the lawsuit by the churches, saying that this was not fair, and they said it was fair. It rejected the comparison of churches to grocery stores, saying that in churches you can have speaking and singing, and that spreads droplets, aerosolized saliva droplets, and spreads the disease and so forth. So we're to think that even if you were going to have social distancing within a church, that's still not enough. And this is different than if you're in a grocery store. Of course, nobody talks to anybody else in a grocery store, I would imagine. Apparently that's the argument. Apparently that's the logic that the court believes in. The court then said, quote, churches can feed the Spirit in other ways, such as live streaming sermons. Really? So now you have a court, a 3-judge panel, telling churches how they can feed the Spirit. That it's enough to feed the Spirit through live streaming. Well, excuse me, if I'm a Catholic and I believe in the real presence, the body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist, tell me how I can get that through a computer. Tell me how I can actually receive the presence of the risen Christ through a computer, through a live streamed video. Is it religious? Where is it anywhere within the purview of the American judicial system the courts have the power to decide how you should practice your religion? That is what they're doing. Make no mistake, it is nothing less. Well, the churches in this case are not done. They're going to try to seek a en banc review by the entire Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and then perhaps then go up to the the U.S. Supreme Court. But in New York, a similar case was brought, and a judge there found differently. The judge there, appointed by President Clinton, issued an injunction against Governor Andrew Cuomo, Attorney General Letitia James, and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. He ruled that they exceeded their executive authorities. He said that they had actively encouraged, de Blasio had actively encouraged participation in protests and openly discouraged religious gatherings and threatened religious worshipers. He said the protests included a flagrant disregard of the outdoor limits and social distancing rules. He said there was a clear message that mass protests are deserving of preferential treatment. He then issued an order that restrained the governor and the mayor from enforcing any indoor gathering limitations greater than those opposed for other, what were called phase 2 industries. So they had to treat churches the same as others. Also forbidden from enforcing any limitation for outdoor gatherings, provided that the participants follow social distancing guidelines. Why would governors do this? Why would they? Why would they? There's an antipathy. There's some reason why they are treating religions differently. We're told, we got to treat other people differently. That we're not all equal. That we can't be united. We're told that we can't go to church. That we're not, all, that we should not all be treated the same, all of us, all the time, everywhere. We're told that we should be more disunited than united. And, I can't help think when I think about all of this, with all this emphasis on skin color, that isn't it odd that, we do have the Eucharist, and we do have Eucharistic miracles. Have you heard about the Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires that occurred in 1996, where a consecrated host, bled, and that a tissue sample was sent to a cardiologist in New York City, didn't tell him what it was, and he identified it as tissue from a human heart. And oh, by the way, they did DNA tests on it. He identified it as human heart tissue. And because of the white blood cells, that it was under severe stress. Remember now, this is part of basically unleavened wheat. And he identified the sample taken from what was before Mass, unleavened wheat, and he identified it as human heart tissue. Unless he just made a mistake. DNA tests were done on it. They couldn't find the DNA. Recently, there was another Eucharistic miracle in 2013 in Legnica, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Poland. Same kind of thing. They've done DNA tests on that host as well. Can't find the DNA. Again, they identified it as human heart tissue. Can't find the DNA. After 6 years, they're still testing. They still can't find it. Could it be because one of the parents of Christ was not human? Could it be because he was divine? And if so, then how can we relegate Christ to one skin color or another? How can we try to pigeonhole him? How can we say, one image is wrong, you should have dark skin. We want Jesus to look this way. I don't know which way he actually looked, but in some ways, he's not like any of us. It doesn't matter. Well, in any event, this has been another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. And we hope some of this has been interesting and provocative, and that it helps you think about something from a little bit of a different light. Maybe you learned about something going on in our society that you weren't otherwise aware of. So we hope it's been beneficial, even in the slightest degree. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you join us again. And until the next time, God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.